The storm arrived before the workday ended, a smear of pewter across the windows, flattening the skyline until the towers looked like graphite sketches. Ideas of buildings, not the buildings themselves. The air conditioning hummed in the ceiling vents, and the espresso machine breathed softly at the end of the corridor, like something alive and benevolent. I cupped a mug in both hands and let the heat find my knuckles. The floor was emptying the way an auditorium empties after the last note, parasols unfolding, elevator bells chiming. It would have been easy to leave with them, to follow the line of dark coats into the rain and disappear into the evening like a sensible person. Instead, I went back to my desk and opened another spreadsheet because there is a kind of comfort in columns, in a balance that has the manners to reveal itself. I had spent a year stitching my life into a clean, workable pattern, mornings quiet, afternoons disciplined, evenings gentle. After my divorce, I had learned to be companion to my own silence, to appreciate the steady conversation of numbers and the patient arguments of process. In the far glass, the city turned on its lamps, a necklace of small lights against the throat of the river. At 6:42, an email arrived from the CEO himself. He could have messaged through his assistant. He could have copied half the company. Instead, it was just the two of us in the to and the from, and a single line. "If you're still here, could you stop by my office before you head out?" There was no subject line. Somehow, that was what made it feel urgent. He had been with the company for only 3 months, an appointment the board described as a seasoned hand with a steady compass, which was the diplomatic way to tell investors that we had chosen someone who could read a storm and decide whether to outlast it or steer us around it. He had the kind of presence that never argued with a room for attention. The room learned to surrender on its own. When he spoke, he did so with a restraint that made his few jokes land more warmly. His rare, unguarded smiles feel like unexpected gifts. I saved my spreadsheet. I smoothed the dress I'd worn the way you press an unread book closed. Then I walked the polished corridor where the carpet swallowed the sound of my steps. And I said his name to the assistant who had her bag already looped over one shoulder, an apology in her posture for still being here. She waved me through. He rose as I entered, as if a habit from an earlier era had not yet been frightened out of him. He said he was sorry to keep me. He said it had been one of those days when everything that needed 10 minutes took 40, and everything that took 40 needed a week. He gestured toward the glass wall that framed the storm. "It sounds better in here," he said, and I realized he had cracked the window open so we could hear the rain. The scent of wet city threaded the room. Asphalt and cedar, a ghost of gasoline, the almost distant sweetness of something blooming in a courtyard we couldn't see. He asked me to sit. He asked about the supply chain reconfiguration I had been mapping, the one no one wanted to approve until something broke, that would make the decision appear inevitable. He listened the way a man listens when he has finally found a person who will speak to him without theater. He asked precise questions and didn't flinch when the answers were inelegant. We talked about the warehouse in Newark and the stubborn contract in Phoenix, about a vendor whose reliability was myth and whose charm might bankrupt us. He had a way of leaning forward without invading space, of making attention feel like shelter, not scrutiny. Somewhere between his question about the long-term lease on the Riverport facility and my answer about exit penalties, the office shifted. Not because anything moved, but because the air recognized that the building was mostly empty now, and the quiet had lowered itself into the room like a velvet curtain. We could hear the elevator hum, the intermittent hiss of the coffee machine rinsing itself clean, the sibilant gossip of rain against the glass. He said my name, not with familiarity, but with that particular care a person reserves for a difficult word they intend to honor. He told me this was the part he hadn't wanted to put in an email. He had just come from the board. A leak had reached the press. An article would be published in the morning. It would be mostly wrong, the way such things are wrong, tidy, insinuating, only half curious about truth. It would suggest that our cutbacks were planned in a way that favored certain divisions, that a whisper network of leadership had insulated itself against the cold. He said there were names involved, none of them mine, but that the article would inevitably shake our floor, and he would need documentation by morning that measured actual decisions against rumor. He hadn't asked me to stay to make the request. He had asked because he knew what would happen after he did. He was the kind of leader who could anticipate the weather inside a person as well as the weather inside a building. He paused then, and something changed in the room again, a small tilt the ear feels before the mind understands. He said that asking me was not just about efficiency, it was about trust. That word moved between us with more weight than any policy ever had. I felt the warmth of my mug return to my palms, as if the porcelain were deciding to be generous again. I said the work would be done. I said I would need access to the older servers and a clearance from legal to pull archived emails between two departments that smiled at each other in meetings and then resented each other into the night. He nodded, relief and respect braided briefly across his face. We worked. He did not hover. He sat on the low couch across from my borrowed chair and read through an old sheaf of notes, the kind that had lived inside a leather folder long enough to have gathered the memory of who he had been before this job. We spoke in a shorthand that evolved quickly between people who are good at what they do and interested in keeping the world from noticing how much they enjoy being good at it. At 8:20, he ordered food but then forgot to open the bag. At 8:40, he finally remembered and pushed a container toward me with the quiet apology of someone who finds it easier to think about numbers than hunger. When the first phase of the document was assembled, columns aligned, times stamped, decisions mapped, I stood to set the printer in the corner going. He rose at the same time and our hands collided at the little plastic tray. We both smiled, the small, embarrassed acknowledgement adults share when a kindness becomes improvisation. My fingertips brushed his sleeve, wool with a softness you only feel when you're not looking for it. The scent of his cologne arrived and retreated in one breath. Restrained, wood and rain. He thanked me then, not for the report, but for what he called the steadiness. He said the word like gratitude had borrowed his voice. He turned toward the window and watched the storm give its last performance. The city was a theater of headlights. Somewhere below, a horn blared and then apologized. He told me that the only luxury he had come to value as he got older was competence in himself and in others. He told me he could see the way I built safety into systems and the way I refused to hoard it for myself. I told him the truth I rarely tell men at work, which is that I prefer process because it forgives me for being human. When my marriage ended, what saved me were routines and measurable outcomes. A file that closed. A budget that balanced. The day that ended and then politely began again. He listened with his head slightly bowed in a gesture I remembered from a photograph of him at a commencement address. He had the face of a man who was learning how to carry a younger version of himself without scolding it. He said he had asked me to stay because he needed the work. Then he said the quiet part. He had asked me to stay because he didn't want to be in this night alone. The storm outside was a prop. The real storm had been the boardroom, the rows of faces that admired and tested him, the old expectations that walked into the room in other people's shoes. He said that leadership, at its most honest, was solitude interrupted by the occasional mercy of the right company. The printer clicked and exhaled. We collated in companionable silence. Papers warmed our hands. He reached past me once, and the brush of closeness felt less like friction and more like orientation, a north I could find in the static. We reviewed the language together, editing away anything that looked like performance, keeping what sounded like an oath. The crisis did not wait for the morning. That night, as if the storm were not satisfied with the rain it had already delivered, an email began circulating from an anonymous account. Screenshots stitched into a narrative that named no names but hinted enough to make everyone think of the ones they feared for or resented. I watched his face change as his phone chimed and then fell quiet, the way a man's expression changes when he sees a headline with his company's name and then sees what's been made of it. He didn't swear. He breathed evenly. He asked if I had seen it. I nodded. We both knew the screenshots had been curated to imply that decisions preceded facts. We both knew that once a story like that finds air, reality has to work twice as hard to breathe. He called legal to give them what we had already prepared, then HR to request they lock access to particular folders. He spoke calmly, without the brittle briskness of anger. When he hung up, he looked at me in a quiet that made a different kind of truth available. He said he had gone home after work the night he got the job and sat in a chair until the house forgot how to be noisy. He said the person he'd been waiting to call was his father, who had taught him how to read, how to apologize, how to add without a calculator. He said the impulse was so strong that he dialed a number that had long ago been given to someone else, and a stranger picked up and said hello into the dark air, and he listened to that word, that hello, as if it were the correct answer to everything. He smiled, a little self-conscious. He said loss changes the shape of achievement. He said that lately he found himself wanting fewer spotlights and more lamplight over a table where two people could work without pretending to be invincible. When he said it, the room decided to understand him. The rain slowed to a patter. The monitor's glow softened. The distance between us felt like a question that had learned to be polite. I could have said many things then. I said only this. I know how to hold a lamp. His eyes lifted at that, and something like relief crossed his face, as if a long note had finally resolved into a chord. The building at that hour grows a personality of its own. The elevator hums less like machinery and more like a cat purring somewhere below the floorboards. The cleaning crew moves through with the grace of people who understand they are resetting a stage, not tidying a mess. We worked until the report felt like a fact that could stand in public without flinching. We did not speak what had gathered between us because naming it would have made it ask for more than either of us was ready to offer on a storm-scrubbed night in a glass office. He walked me to the elevator because there are rituals that mean more than they pretend to. In the mirrored doors, our reflections looked like two people who had learned a dialect only the late hour understands. He pressed the down button and then didn't step away. The elevator arrived and yawned open, a small, illuminated room. We entered. The doors closed on their familiar hush. Halfway down, the elevator shuddered the way old buildings clear their throats. We paused between floors, a polite halt rather than a trap. The panel lit up with a neat red line, and then, as quickly, resumed. In that heartbeat of stillness, I felt the air between us change temperature. His voice, when he finally spoke, had that roughness restraint gives it. He said he had asked me to stay late because he trusted me to protect the company. He said what he hadn't said was that he trusted me to protect him from himself. The version of him that would have stayed until dawn alone, pretending that solitude was the same as strength. He did not reach for my hand. He did not ask for anything. He looked at the panel numbers with the attention of a man pretending to watch something else. I did what I had wanted to do once earlier at the printer and had not permitted. I let my fingertips rest for a second on the back of his sleeve, a touch so modest it could have been mistaken for balancing myself as the elevator resumed. Heat climbed from skin to fabric. He did not move. The doors opened, and the lobby welcomed us with its careful marble and its after-hours hush. We stood at the revolving doors, rain glittering beyond like a curtain of beads. A car coasted past with jazz uncurled from the window, a saxophone sounding like someone practicing tenderness. He said that in the morning there would be meetings that felt like cross-examinations, and he would need to bring into those rooms the steadiness we had built here tonight. He asked if he could borrow mine. I said he could, but that he would have to return it, untattered, unconfiscated. He promised. I believed him because he said it without flourish. The article arrived at dawn with the specificity of a clock. It made tidier claims than reality, and named no one directly but left breadcrumbs for a reader skilled at suspicion. The board convened an emergency session and then decided to call it a routine one. HR reviewed access logs like holy texts. Legal wrote sentences that wanted to pass for mathematics. The company bristled, then straightened its blouse. I moved through those rooms with my report and my unremarkable cardigan and the kind of composure that keeps panic from meeting itself. They asked him the kinds of questions that are really statements. Did you know? When did you know? Who told you? Why did you not foresee? He answered the way good men answer when they refuse to barter their dignity for immediate exoneration. Plainly, precisely, without handing anyone a person to blame who didn't deserve it. Once, his eyes found me across a table. He didn't linger. He didn't ask for anything. The glance had the softness of a hand steadying a lamp. By afternoon, the leaks had been matched to their faucets. A disgruntled manager nursing a slight from 3 reorganizations ago. A consultant who mistook access for entitlement. A junior analyst who wanted to seem inside and had wandered dangerously close to sabotage. The press updated a paragraph. The stock fell and then stood back up. The story did what stories do. It found the next event to feed on. In the after-quiet, the building exhaled. He stopped by my desk without theater, the way a person steps into a kitchen and reaches for a glass of water. He said thank you, and the words were fuller than the morning's coffee. He said he owed me more than a bonus and less than an apology. I told him he owed me precisely what we had agreed to at the revolving doors. A return of the steadiness, intact. The rumor about us, because there is always a rumor, rose like steam and then lost interest when it realized there were no headlines to harvest. I caught it in a colleague's half-smile, in a message that ended in an ellipsis. I let it pass by because there is a difference between secrecy and privacy, and I have grown attached to the latter. We worked. We trusted each other to know when to speak, and when the quiet was eloquent enough on its own. 2 weeks later, the city stepped into a generous stretch of weather. At 5:30, sunlight slid across desks with an easy hand. He asked if I could spare a walk to the lobby. We rode the elevator in the company of a woman carrying flowers, their scent a sudden civilized jungle. In the lobby, he turned to me with the kind of calm that precedes a question that will change the slope of the next few months. He said he thought often about the way the word late sounds. It can be an hour on a clock or it can be a regret. He said he wanted to be the first kind of late with me. A handful of evenings we gave willingly to each other, unremarkable on a calendar and therefore priceless. He said he did not want scandal or declarations. He wanted to know whether there was a small corner of my life where he might be allowed to sit and be human, and see if being human together made us both braver. My answer was less articulate and more true. I told him that the night in his office, while the storm auditioned all its voices, an old loneliness realized it had overstayed its lease. I told him I was willing to see what happened if we paid attention to something that had already begun and refused to pretend it hadn't. I told him I would not be a secret because I did not require a stage. He understood. The relief that moved through his shoulders felt like a door quietly unlocked. What followed did not resemble the stories people tell when they need drama to justify feeling. It was coffee before the building woke, the steam drawing small ghosts above our cups. It was a walk around the block at lunch, rain flirting with our hair and then changing its mind. It was an elevator delay where the hum settled under our feet, and we breathed in time and smiled because there were no words that needed rescue. When we came to each other at last, we did so with the patience of people who know their own names and like them. The night faded around us, leaving only breath and promise. We did not light fireworks. We found the switch to a lamp and let the room show itself. The crisis became footnote, the project became muscle memory, the building resumed its practical rhythms. On a Thursday in early fall, the ficus near the window produced an improbable new leaf, as if to prove that persistence is its own adventure. He led as he had promised he would, with steadiness borrowed and returned, with the kind of authority that treats certainty as a hypothesis to be tested. I did my work. We learned each other's weather. In the evenings, sometimes we stayed late, though not because the world demanded it. Because the city looked good through glass at that hour, and because the elevator hum had learned our names, and because jazz sometimes drifted upward from a bar we never found, giving the air the sound of a second chance politely accepted. Months later, we stood at his window at the end of a day that had asked for everything and then, decently, paid for it. The office lights dimmed one by one, obedient as stars to a whispered cue. His hand rested at the small of my back, warm without claiming. Somewhere below, a woman crossed the street holding her coat closed at her throat. I recognized the gesture. I had done it 1,000 times and would again. But the warmth at my spine told me I would no longer mistake the whole weather for wind. He asked me if staying late had turned out to mean regret. I told him it had meant only this: that sometimes the door you think you're holding open for work is really an invitation to a life, and the right person will stand in it without rushing you through. He smiled, not the public smile, but the one that belongs to lamplight and unadvertised relief. We left then, not because anything was finished, but because together is how the evening would make the most sense. The elevator opened with its familiar forgiving hum, and we stepped inside. The city carried on without noticing that two people had chosen something quiet and therefore sturdy. The rain had decided to stop. The air smelled like the first good page of a book. And I thought as the doors slid closed that all he had really said that night was, "Please don't let me do this alone," and all I had really answered was, "I won't."